for him unless he is detained?
Unless he's overthrown and, like Slobodan Milosevic, handed over by a successor regime, it means he can't travel because he might be arrested. And it may indeed encourage the process at home of his replacement. We don't know very much, if anything, at least people like me don't know anything about what's going on in the Kremlin to see his overturn and replacement. But there's enough information seeping out to indicate that there are some who are unhappy with his leadership. And having your leader labeled and treated as a criminal throughout the world might just be a bit of an encouragement to see change of regime becoming more palatable or appealing to those who would like trade to continue and develop, something to be decided about the assets of their country that have been frozen around the world and so on. So he may be handed over, he may not. He may disappear into Russia if somebody else takes over. His life may come to an end. But in itself, it's a very important process, and I'm grateful that Karim Khan and his team have finally brought this out.
Interesting what you're saying there as well, that you think that this could well be a catalyst. It may embolden those who are perhaps harbouring some kind of desire to see him overthrown.
Yes, I think it may do. It may have all sorts of other effects. For example, there's a movement abroad started by some Ukrainian parliamentarians to relieve Russia of its powers in the Security Council. Now, those powers have meant that Mr. Khan can't deal with the crime of aggression. If the moves already being taken by Ukrainian parliamentarians in their advocacy around the world to, for example, have Russia suspended from being effective in the Security Council, something to match what happened to South Africa for 20 years under the apartheid regime, then that might free up the potential for him to be dealt with by the ICC for aggression as well. That would be extremely helpful so far as Ukraine is concerned. Just a minute, let me turn this off. Right,
that's the rival broadcaster, I think, trying to get you.
No, I don't think it is, actually. It might be. No, I don't think it is. So that's one thing that might develop. And there was a second thing, but now my mind's been interrupted, so I've forgotten what it was.
But that could be a very significant development if Russia was removed from the Security Council.
Oh, yes, it could. And there's another important thing to bear in mind, that for Ukraine, arguably the most important thing to happen when the fighting ends, and assuming that Ukraine is indeed on the winning side, is what's going to happen to the funds that are frozen. Now, lawyers will tell you, lawyers from all around the world will tell you that their respective countries that have frozen assets of Russia may find it more difficult in law to seize them and hand them over to Ukraine, which really needs those assets to rebuild its infrastructure, indeed to rebuild its country. Now, again, each move towards criminalizing or saying that Russia is indeed criminal, not to criminalize it, just say it is criminal, may ease the process perhaps by relying on United Nations resolutions and matters of that sort, might make it much easier to free up those countries that need political will to say, well, we've not just seized the money, but we've not just frozen the money, we've seized it, and Ukraine, here it is, use it. So that could be another great step forward. And for those of us who are often unhappy and uncertain about the development of the international criminal law, because in practice it is often slow and partial and so on and so forth, this really is a very, very constructive and positive move.
Now, this, of course, has been breaking news while we've been on air. Neither of us have had the chance to read all of the detail. Quite specific charges, isn't it, about the deportation of children? You thought there was something else in there as well. Many of the international bodies been calling for the war crime of aggression. Now, this is quite different. It's very specific. What are your thoughts on why it's that aspect that he has been charged with?
Well, he hasn't been charged with that because he can't be charged by that, because for technical reasons, although Ukraine afforded the ICC jurisdiction over the war, you can't try Russia at the moment without a Security Council resolution. You can't have Russia tried by the investigated and tried by the ICC for the crime of aggression. That's why I suggested that this whole business of the arrest warrant might help those who want to see the removal of or the suspension of Russia's veto powers in the Security Council, and that would then enable the crime of aggression to be investigated and tried. You may know, and your viewers may know, that there's already an independent tribunal into aggression proposed by Ukraine, and with support from quite a number of bodies and governments and parliaments around the world. Now, that may be quite a good idea in itself, but it's adding a layer of complexity. Nothing would be better than for the existing powers of the ICC to investigate and try aggression to be released, as they could be if Russia is itself relieved of its power to exercise a veto in the Security Council.
Do you think, because of the specific charge there about the deportation of children, we were hearing from Dominic Waghorn here in the studio, it's some hundreds of thousands of them allegedly been deported. Will it make any difference to them, to their fate, because of this charge now being out there?
I don't think I can answer that. I think that's a question for your political and possibly security experts. What I can say is that dealing with children in the way that's alleged and indeed shown in various programs, including your own, I think, that's a crime under both crimes against humanity, where something has to be widespread and systematic, and it's probably shown to be widespread and systematic, and it can be a crime, a straightforward, regular Geneva Convention war crime. So I can't say what's likely to happen in Russia. I mean, unhappily, one has to say it could go both ways, I suppose, but that's not for me, that's for others to comment on.
We really appreciate your time, particularly at such short notice, to come and talk to us. So, Geoffrey Nice, thank you very much indeed. We're going to bring in Dominic Waghorn now. Dominic, I know you've been monitoring various reaction to this breaking news that's caught us all a little bit on the hop. Some reaction from the Ukrainian Prosecutor General.
Yeah, all we've heard from the chief of the Ukrainian presidential staff is that the ICC arrest warrant for Putin is only the beginning, and the prosecutors are also saying that they're encouraged by what's happened. So for them, it's hugely significant and more than symbolic. Although Russia's foreign ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova has said very quickly after the ICC announcement that, as far as they're concerned, the decision to issue an arrest warrant for Putin has no significance whatsoever. So a predictable reaction from Moscow, and Kyiv quick to say that as far as they're concerned, this is just the beginning of efforts to bring Vladimir Putin to justice. Interesting.
OK, Dominic, thank you very much. Indeed, don't go far away, because I'm sure we're going to be bringing you back in shortly. For now, though, I'm joined by the lawyer and legal commentator Joshua Rosenberger. Good afternoon to you, Mr. Rosenberger. Are you surprised by this?
It is surprising, isn't it? Because it's such a dramatic move by the ICC prosecutor to actually issue an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin and also his Commissioner for Children's Rights, who works in his office, on this allegation of responsibility for the war crime of unlawful deportation of children and the unlawful transfer of children from occupied areas of Ukraine to the Russian Federation. These are dramatic crimes. Of course, there is the practicality. Obviously, Putin is not going to stand trial unless he is arrested, and he's not going to be arrested while he remains running Russia. And presumably the same applies to Maria Belova, his Commissioner for Children's Rights. But nevertheless, it is a dramatic move, and it shows how the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court has been working to try to achieve this. We know that a trial chamber at the International Criminal Court in The Hague considered warrants, the application of warrants in secret in order to protect victims and witnesses and to safeguard the investigation. And it says, mindful of the fact that the conduct is allegedly ongoing and the public awareness of the warrants may contribute to the prevention of further crimes, the chamber of the court considered it was in the interest of justice to allow this to be disclosed, the existence of the warrants, the name of the suspects, the crime, and the related facts. So we have this slightly unusual announcement. The way the International Criminal Court works is sometimes that it has arrest warrants but doesn't tell the suspects for obvious reasons. It doesn't want to tip them off. But on this occasion, yes, we have got this announcement and all the publicity that goes with it.
And would you agree with Sir Geoffrey Nice that this effectively raises the stakes for countries that have not been hostile to President Putin and his regime?
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, Putin is clearly going nowhere, and so there's no question of any country that might support the International Criminal Court carrying out this arrest warrant. But yes, it does raise the stakes, doesn't it? It just reminds people that there is law, that the law is imperfect, international criminal law is imperfect because the International Criminal Court has no police force of its own. It relies on states to cooperate with it. And as things stand, nothing very much is going to happen in the short term. But nevertheless, it does show that there is the possibility of criminal charges, something that Putin would have been well aware of ever since he started this. He obviously thinks that this hasn't deterred what he's done over the past year or so. But yes, it is a significant move, isn't it? Here is a statement from the prosecutor saying, there are reasonable grounds to believe that Mr. Putin bears individual criminal responsibility for these crimes, for having committed these acts directly, jointly with others, for his failure to exercise control properly over civilian and military subordinates who committed the act or allowed for their commission and who were under his effective authority and control. And this is just one crime that he's being sought for. So yes, this is the beginning of what many people hope will lead to international criminal justice. But clearly, so long as he remains in charge and so long as he remains in Moscow, nothing very much is going to happen.
Could it, though, catalyse further isolation of President Putin, very significant isolation, i.e. the removal of Russia from the Security Council?
Well, that's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because the International Criminal Court is not directly part of the United Nations. It is a separate body set up by a number of states. But on the other hand, it has close links with the United Nations because the United Nations can refer cases to the International Criminal Court. It's really a matter for the United Nations. I don't suppose the United Nations needs to be told that what Putin is doing is breaking international law, is breaking the UN Charter. And you might think that, unlawful deportation is a relatively minor charge compared with, what Putin has been responsible for over the past year or more. But yes, it does show that the tide is turning, perhaps.
Does it tell you, though, given you're describing it there as a relatively minor charge, still very significant, isn't it, for all of the families and indeed the children who've been affected by this? Does it tell us that the fact that they've gone for that one is that it is the charge that they feel they have the most evidence for?
Yes, it does. It shows it's the most practical charge. What we don't know is what other charges are available, what other charges are being considered at the same time. All we know is that they have chosen to bring this particular charge to public attention at the moment. There is, and I think you were discussing with Geoffrey Nice, the broader question of the crime of aggression. But that's something that will require international agreement in order that it would be possible to bring these charges. This is a practical charge, which the prosecutor has put evidence to the court over, which the court has authorized an arrest warrant for, and which the prosecutor believes he can take action over, subject, as we keep saying, to the need to actually get Putin behind bars, to have him arrested, which he's not going to be at the moment. But who knows what's going to happen? It must give comfort, I would have thought, to Ukrainians, as you've been reporting, to the families of children who've been allegedly deported. And as I said, the whole point of this is to try to put him on notice that the more he carries on, the more risk there is of further charges, or at least charges relating to this particular alleged war crime.
Yeah, I mean, Ukrainians will note this as a significant move, but they will probably also be saying not before time. We've been asking for this for months. Sir Geoffrey Nice was saying there that perhaps the ICC has been under external pressure not to do so. What's your view?
Oh, I don't think so. I don't think so. I think the prosecutor of the ICC, a British QC, Karim Khan, a British KC, Karim Khan, a senior barrister, knows that this is the making of the International Criminal Court. If he can pursue charges against Putin and put Putin on trial, this will justify the decision of the international community to set up a permanent international criminal court that can put individuals on trial for war crimes. I think he has been trying extremely hard to do this. He may well have thought, and there may be these sealed arrest warrants, these charges which we haven't been told about. They may all be lined up, and he may have good reasons for not making them public. But no, I think he has been working extremely hard together with other members of the international community, supported by the United Kingdom, to gather evidence. And he has thought that this is the right time now to actually announce these arrest warrants and to pursue Putin and this the Commissioner for Children's Rights in his office. So I don't think that he's been dragging his feet, but I do think he's well aware that that he doesn't want the International Criminal Court to look powerless, and it is powerless so long as Putin remains in charge in Russia.
Yeah, we've been talking a little bit about legally what might flow from this. Sir Geoffrey Nice was saying that perhaps once there is an acknowledgement of war crimes being committed, that could help with the frozen assets to then give them to Ukraine in order for them to start to rebuild their country eventually.
That would be very desirable, wouldn't it? But we are talking about separate criminal processes. You know, this is one court which is seeking to put him on trial, for which purpose he has to be arrested, and then there has to be a trial, and any trial is clearly months, years off, even after he's arrested. And then there's a question of punishment. So I think it's probably separate from assets and what relates to it. I mean, the powers of the criminal court, the International Criminal Court, are to send people to prison. Prison places are provided by supporters of the International Criminal Court, including the United Kingdom. I'm not sure that it's actually going to have a direct effect on the conduct of the war, on assets, on anything like that. But it's clearly a sign that the international legal order is determined to do what it can to try to bring Putin to justice.
All right, Joshua Rosenberg, thank you very much indeed for joining us again. Also at very short notice, some news which has taken many people by surprise. That is that the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin. We will be looking into what that means and all of the relevant legal implications of that at the top of the hour, which is now. If you are joining us, it is 4 o'clock. You are watching Sky News. The developing story at this hour, the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Russia's President Vladimir Putin. It accuses him of being responsible for war crimes committed in Ukraine. An arrest warrant has also been issued for Russia's Children's Rights Commissioner, that is for unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children. The ICC has released this video statement within the last hour.
The International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation. It is forbidden by international law for occupying powers to transfer civilians from the territory they live in to other territories. Children enjoy special protection under the Geneva Convention. The contents of the warrants are secret in order to protect victims. The ICC attaches great importance to the protection of victims, especially children. Nevertheless, the judges of the chamber dealing with this case decided to make the existence of the warrants public in the interest of justice and to prevent the commission of future crimes. This is an important moment in the process of justice before the ICC. The judges have reviewed the information and evidence submitted by the prosecutor and determined that there are credible allegations against these persons for the alleged crimes. The ICC is doing its part of work. As a court of law, the judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
Well, that was the president of the ICC there announcing that arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin. Well, Russia has responded to the warrant for President Putin's arrest. It is, as you might expect, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson Maria Zakharova has said the decisions of the International Criminal Court have no meaning for our country, including from a legal point of view. Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and bears no obligations under it. Well, let's bring in our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn. We also have here in the studio retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Dominic, to you first, a pretty predictable response there from the Russian spokesperson. What in practice does this mean?
Good question. I mean, let's get some reaction also from the Ukrainians, which is important. If we're going to quote the Russians, let's certainly quote the Ukrainians. The Prosecutor General in Kyiv, Andrei Kostin, has said the decision by the ICC was historic for Ukraine and the entire international law system. And Andriy Yermak, the chief of the presidential staff, says the warrant is only the beginning. And of course, Ukrainians are building a whole dossier, a number of dossiers of evidence against the Russians to do with atrocities in Bucha, atrocities to do with deportations, and particularly to do with children. So they will be sending that to the ICC, no doubt. What's interesting about this, I think, is the ICC is focusing on this issue of very troubling issue of what's happening to Ukrainian children. As Stuart was saying in Dnipro earlier, the figures vary. I think one respected independent study claims that 6,000 Ukrainian children have been deported, so taken from Ukraine under various circumstances, deported into Russia, and then there is on Russian state media, there's visible evidence of them being handed out at railway stations to families adopting them. But beyond that, we don't really know what's happening to these children. Now, the Ukrainians say that the figure's more like 14 or 16,000. The Russians themselves have said since 2014, 700,000 children have been deported with their families. Now, they're saying that many of them have gone willingly. So there's a huge question mark about the fate of these children. And I think it's really interesting that the ICC is focusing on that, highlighting that issue. And of course, it's going to have implications, I think. It's symbolic in the sense that Putin won't be brought to justice anytime soon. But this makes him even more of a pariah. There's now an arrest warrant out for the leader of Russia, and I think it will make those nations who've sat on the fence so far, who've hedged their bets, those countries, and there are a number of them, India, a number of African countries, countries close to Russia who have abstained in votes at the UN about Russia being called on to withdraw its forces from Ukraine.
The stakes are now much higher for the position they take.
Now, some of those countries have done so because they're worried about, they're hedging their bets literally because they don't know who's going to win. Kazakhstan, for instance, does not want to blot its copybook in Moscow if Russia wins this war some way or another. But I think a lot of it has been motivated by a kind of a moral ambiguity. I think a doubt about NATO's case and a doubt about Ukraine's case. And some of them have bought Russia's line that this is all about NATO expansion and just self-defence. So I think it obviously plays into that. And it will make it harder for those countries to abstain. and give support to Russia, not just diplomatically by abstaining, but also behind the scenes buying Russian oil. So I think it puts pressure on those countries, and I think that's probably the most likely way this has a material impact on the conflict.
Let's bring you in here, Sean. Are there any military implications from this announcement?
I think one of the concerns is how does this conflict eventually get brought to an end? After Putin invaded Ukraine, hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost. The Russian military have not performed well on the battlefield. And so I think the international community is trying to find a way to give Putin an off-ramp. In other words, how do you call an end to this brutality? Because otherwise it'll just perpetuate. Anything that further isolates Putin's position has a risk that it risks him literally just doubling down and focusing his determination to continue this conflict. I think what's interesting for me on the United Nations, 141 countries damned his invasion, tried to get him to reverse it, or at least withdraw his forces. It was water off the duck's back to Putin. What matters to Putin is he draws power from Russia itself, yet he absolutely controls the information flow into the country itself. And it doesn't seem to me this is going to help bring the war to an end anytime soon, but that's purely from a military perspective. And
is your sense that this might heighten the aggression coming from Putin?
It's difficult to tell what impact it would have in the future, but if President Putin saw a way of bringing this war to an end, and there was lots of diplomatic language about how he might be willing to start to talk, whether as long as he could secure the Donbass and the Crimea, that maybe he'd be open to negotiation. If he knows that when that's finished, he's going to be in front of an international criminal court, it's hard to see him being any rush to bring this conflict to a conclusion. And most military analysts think that actually his ambitions lie well beyond the Donbass and Crimea, almost certainly to the full extent of Ukraine, and potentially beyond that more to the former Soviet Union. And I think that's really worrying in the long term. And it's not saying that this indictment is wrong. It's just trying to see how this helps bring this conflict to an end earlier, because the brutality, the hundreds of thousands of lives that have been lost, there's got to be a compromise eventually to bring this to an end. And how that happens is a primary focus from a military analyst perspective.
OK, all right. Gentlemen, don't go far away, because we'll be needing to bring in your analysis as we move on throughout the afternoon. But for now, let's bring in our US correspondent who joins us now from Washington. Hello there to you, Mark. A surprise announcement for many. What is the US reaction likely to be?
We can talk about it as likely to be. There hasn't been any official US reaction at the moment, but President Biden does have a specific person, an ambassador at large, as she's known, whose task from a US perspective for many months now has been to pursue Vladimir Putin, along with European, British and other criminal justice systems, to bring him to a courtroom. And I spoke to her a couple of weeks ago, and the first, I guess, most obvious question I asked her was how likely it would be that man there, President Putin, would ever be in a courtroom. And her response was interesting. She said, look, we've got to play the long game. There is no expectation that this man would be arrested any time soon. But then she pointed out to history, Augusto Pinochet, Slobodan Milosevic, the leader Habré of Chad. All of those people never thought that they would face justice. Many around the world thought they wouldn't face justice, yet they did. And I think that is the driver for people like Ambassador Van Schaak, who I'm talking about, President Biden's representative in this arena. She described the various avenues that she and others are pursuing to try and bring not just Putin, but all of those around him. Joining the dots is how she described it, from low-level commanders on the ground in Ukraine, joining those dots and providing evidence that join those dots that lead right to the top, to the Kremlin. And she said, she described one avenue as being the Prosecutor General in Ukraine, investigating these cases in their own domestic Ukrainian court system. That is ongoing. doing, and the UK, the European Union, and others are helping helping Ukraine with that matter. The second avenue is the one that we're focused on now, and that is the International Criminal Court, which has been, as we say, for many months, been looking into material evidence against the Russian Federation, against Vladimir Putin. So much evidence. I was struck one thing that she said to me, that because of the digital world that we live in, there is so much digital evidence that they are having to sift through, to collate. CCTV on people's doorsteps in towns and villages across Ukraine. Personal TV cameras have all caught atrocities in towns like Bucha, in Irpin, outside Kyiv. They've got all of that. Everyone has a mobile phone, and many of these atrocities have been caught on mobile phone as well. All of this is now in the hands of prosecutors in different countries. And as I say, they're trying to join the dots to be able to prove that as Commander-in-Chief, Vladimir Putin was ultimately responsible for this. You've been talking a bit too about this idea of a crime of aggression. That is something that is very, very important to Vladimir Zelensky. He wants to pursue that particular crime, which is clearly another avenue that they're looking at, and it's not that one particular avenue can work on its own. There are many that can work together. It's worth saying too that the United States has a complicated relationship with the International Criminal Court. It's not a member of the court itself, but it likes to think that despite not being a member, it can help to pursue justice for people who need to be brought to justice. There's an added complication specifically on the crime of aggression, because the crime of aggression could be pursued because Russia invaded Ukraine. Well, some point back a few years to Iraq. The long shadow of Iraq exists still, and there have been some who have called for a crime of aggression against the United States for what it did in Iraq. Her response to that is that this is there is no equivalence between the two. But certainly, from my conversation with her in the State Department a few weeks ago, it's so clear that on so many levels, behind the scenes, quietly, there are people on the ground in Ukraine collecting evidence all the time. Indeed, she has been there recently herself, and they are building a case using all these different avenues to try and bring President Putin and those around him, right the way down to commander level as well, bring them to justice. We wait for them to slip up, she says, whether it's senior commanders who travel abroad using aliases. If we've got the evidence, if we've got the names, the photographs, we can arrest them. And as Dominic was saying, if Vladimir Putin was to travel to a country that's tied to the ICC, to that system, then he too could be arrested. Unlikely, yes, but it's a long game, she said.
All right, Mark, thank you very much indeed, bringing us the perspective there from the United States. We await a formal response from the White House. We know President Joe Biden is currently in bilateral meeting with the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar. Dominic, let's bring you back in here. We're talking about quite a specific the arrest warrant for quite a specific war crime, not just President Vladimir Putin, but also Russia's children's commissioner as well, wanted for arrest there. She has responded.
Yes, Maria Lvova-Belova, who has been a notorious figure throughout the war because of what she's done with children. Now, she has claimed to be saving children. She's adopted a number of children herself, and she has been seen on Russian state television weeping with joy, she's been claiming, as she has talked about the children she saved. She claims to have adopted 22 Ukrainian orphans, one of whom was interviewed in a very creepy Russian state TV piece, where whether he was under duress or not, he said how grateful he was to her for being saved. And when Vladimir Putin appeared recently in a stadium in Moscow, a number of Ukrainian orphans were brought onto the stage, and amongst them was a girl, a 15-year-old girl, who was abducted by Russian soldiers a week into the conflict. Her parents were killed by these soldiers. She went missing, and then she reappeared in the stadium. Now, the Russians have been claiming, and this is really for propaganda, I think, for domestic purposes, that they are saving these children from what they regard, or what they claim to regard as Nazi-controlled Ukraine. And so we've talked about how this conflict is sort of it's a kind of Alice in Wonderland, looking through the looking glass kind of way it's portrayed in Russia. What we see as abhorrent, they are celebrating. So the abduction and deportation of children in their thousands, they say, is an act of salvation, saving these children from Nazi-controlled Ukraine. So in that context, we can quote what she has said, which she says that in response to the arrest warrant being issued for her from the ICC, she says, "It's great that the ICC appreciated my work to help children of this country." So as far as she's concerned, or is claiming to be concerned, she is saving these children, and therefore, in a very twisted, perverted way, really, she's claiming that she's getting credit from the ICC for her work. But I think this obviously makes a pariah of her as much as it does of the president, and it focuses the spotlight very clearly now on the president being directly involved, allegedly, in this war crime of abducting children.
All right, thank you very much indeed, Dominic. As I said before, don't go far away, gentlemen, because we are needing your analysis as we unpick these developments throughout the hour. Let's bring in now Mary Dejevsky, a foreign affairs journalist and also columnist for The Independent. Good to see you this afternoon. Mary, what do you make of this announcement from the ICC?
Well, I think, you know, we've heard an awful lot of analysis from the other correspondents, most of which I absolutely agree with. I think one of the things that's coming out of Washington, which is often said about the Iraq war, this is already the most documented war probably in history. And Ukrainians themselves, charities, foreign aid organizations, there is masses and masses of evidence, and Ukraine practically from the beginning has seen it as a sort of mission to bring people to justice and to document what's going on in Ukraine. And I think this is a very important aspect. When we look at the actual charge and the fact that it's being made today and that it's against Putin, not just his sort of children's commissioner, but against Putin in particular, I think it's very interesting that it's quite a limited charge. It's this child deportation charge, which is, of course, not just limited, it's also very emotive. Around the world, it'll cross countries and cultures, that this is about children. So that's one thing to say. Second thing to say is that, of course, when it's looked from Russia, and I think we've had the foreign ministry spokesman already saying this charge actually means nothing, because there is no way that any action can be taken against Putin. It's purely hypothetical, and that plays into what Mark was saying about the United States and the UN and the ICC playing a long game here.
What do you think follows from this? What does it catalyse potentially?
Well, I think one of the things that follows is that Putin, who is already a pariah across the West, this is not going to help. And Russia actually, you know, it knows that it's in very big PR trouble across the West, although it has, if not allies, then these people who've been relatively neutral at the UN. But Russia generally doesn't like being singled out for, as it were, international indiscretions of this kind by international institutions. So I think even as they belittle it, it's something that will actually hit home. But I also think that in a much, much wider perspective, the fact that this has been announced today, maybe it's not connected, maybe it is connected. It's the same day that it's been announced that Xi Jinping is going to Moscow and he's going to talk to Putin, among other things, about China's peace plan for Ukraine. Now, I can imagine that as seen from the Western world, this is not a welcome development.
I see. Could this change the conversation, do you think, between the Chinese president and the Russian president?
I doubt it will, because I suspect that the attitude on both their sides is going to be, well, you know, the International Criminal Court, this is way down the line, these charges are very limited. And, you know, I think, as Dominic was sort of saying, that Russia could parry these charges, because it could say that The reason it was taking children across the border was to rescue them, to save them from conditions in a war zone. So it's not completely cut and dried. You know, what we call deportation and abduction is described in Russia as saving and rescuing. And, you know, it's you can say, well, this is a cynical way of looking at it, but that's not how a lot of Russians will look at it.
All right, Mary Dejevsky, thank you very much for talking to us here on Sky News. Now, the UN Security Council does give a daily briefing. They have been asked a question specifically about this development from the ICC. Let's have a listen to the response.
You know, that's a question for speculation. That's not something, again, the president of the General Assembly, his boundaries, if I can call them, end within the General Assembly. You know, there's always issue about a diplomat or a delegate or someone who might have trouble getting visas or something like that. That is for the Secretariat. That is not something that the General Assembly deals with. So I would ask you to perhaps ask Stefan that very same question. I was planning to. Excellent, excellent. Pam, if I can, the other question that you asked me was whether there is a meeting, would the president want to have a meeting on this topic? That's what you had asked me for. And so my response to that would be, as you know, it's up to member states to come forward and say that they want a meeting on a specific issue. So obviously, if a member state says that they want to discuss this in the General Assembly, I know that the president would do that. The president's door is always open.
Well, let's bring Dominic and Sean Bell back in here. Sean, you were saying to me earlier that as far as the war goes, this probably doesn't help bring it to some kind of conclusion.
No, and the problem is here is that it's really difficult to see how wars like this come to an end because the only way either one side wins or the other side wins. It's very difficult to see how Russia can ever actually win this war. Taking the whole of Ukraine and subjugating it all seems well beyond the reach of Russia. Likewise, Ukraine expelling every last Russian out of every corner of the Donbass and Crimea again seems unlikely. So eventually both sides are going to have to talk. To do that, they need to be able to be ready to talk and ready to compromise. And I think that's going to be increasingly difficult if Putin doesn't see the off-ramp. The other thing I think is interesting about this is that a lot of the discussion about this legal issue is whether or not Russia should be expelled from the United Nations. I think what's fascinating about that, the forerunner of the United Nations was the League of Nations, and the former Soviet Union was expelled from that as a result of its invasion of Finland. The problem is the reason the United Nations was formed, the reason the G7, the G20, all these organisations, is not because everybody has to agree, but the war should be the last weapon of choice if you can't negotiate, talk, compromise. And the moment you start throwing out nations out of that sort of assembly, you run a graver risk that wars are becoming more likely. And it's a really difficult, nuanced point. But I do think there's more to this than just expelling Russia out of the United Nations. Somehow, Russia's got to be punished for this, but also, most primarily from a legal, particularly from a military perspective, they've got to find a way of drawing this war to a close, because otherwise the killing is going to continue, hundreds of thousands of innocent people, millions that have been relocated, and that, from a military perspective, needs to be the primary focus.
Dominic, I know that you have been monitoring international reaction. Perhaps you can bring us up to speed on what other countries have been saying, and then also, as well, your perspective on what it means for the conflict on the ground in Ukraine.
Yeah, I mean, we've had a little bit of international reaction, not an awful lot so far. The Czechs have said that they welcome the decision. The Russians have said that it has no significance whatsoever. Ukrainians welcoming it as well. And just to pick up on what Sean was saying, I think we've said throughout this, haven't we, that no one can afford to lose this war. NATO and the West can't afford to lose because it then gives a carte blanche to any dictator to invade another country and get away with it. Russia can't afford to lose it, or Putin can't afford to lose it because he is, I mean, in his essence, effectively a gangster, and gangsters can't lose. They then look weak and they're then vulnerable. He's even less able now to lose because he is an indicted war criminal. And it makes it much more complicated, I think, to head towards what we have been expecting, which is some kind of diplomatically negotiated end to this conflict, which is how most conflicts end. I mean, it's hard now to imagine Putin an indicted war criminal, or a war criminal at least with an arrest warrant out for him, sitting negotiating with the Ukrainians. It certainly makes that harder to imagine. And one other insight, I think, if we look at Putin, biographers, what they have noted about him and his reaction to another dictator and his fate, Muammar Gaddafi, the Libyan dictator, who was also indicted by the ICC. Some biographers claim that Putin has watched the tape of him being dragged out of that culvert in Tripoli and being beaten to death over and over again because he is so occupied with the idea that could happen to him. And that's what's motivated him most about suppressing any kind of public and political opposition in Russia. So now he's joining the ranks of the likes of Muammar Gaddafi. That's going to focus his mind, but probably not to end this war, but to try and win it. I was going to say,
it doesn't give him a ladder that he can climb down.
It makes the off-ramp harder to imagine, I think, yeah.
My last contributor there, Mary Dejevsky, is saying that perhaps what has catalysed this announcement from the ICC now is the visit of the Chinese president to Russia.
I think it's possible. I think lawyers and courts tend to operate on their own timetable. But I think if we're looking at what China's reaction to this will be, I think it doesn't recognise the ICC. It certainly hasn't signed the treaty that set up the ICC, because at the heart of the ICC is the principle of extraterritorial jurisprudence, and the Chinese are very much opposed to the idea that one country or one court can interfere in the sovereign affairs of another. Now, that hasn't stopped it voting or abstaining on votes that have condemned Russia for interfering violently in the affairs of another country. But that is a central principle of Chinese foreign policy. So it hasn't signed up to the ICC. Whether that precludes it from supporting this, I don't know. I think it makes it more complicated for Xi Jinping as he goes to Moscow. I think it's unlikely that kind of motivated the court, which I think would have been operating more in a question of what evidence it's gathered and whether it felt it was in the right position to issue this warrant at this time.
You were reflecting the response from the Russian Foreign Ministry a short while ago, very predictable response. Russia does not, this from the Kremlin, Russia does not recognise the jurisdiction of the ICC. Any ICC decisions are null and void for Russia, as you'd expect. Yes, and the Foreign Ministry spokeswoman, Maria Zakharova, who's a pretty feisty speaker and very combative in her daily briefing, she says this warrant has no significance whatsoever, which is what you'd expect. You'd expect, I think, defiance from Moscow. Behind the scenes, though, I think Putin will be worried by this and worried about what it means for his future and the way the war is going to continue in the future. All right, Dominic, thank you. Sean, just on the wires here, I can see commander of Ukrainian ground forces said that Russian forces are trying to break through Ukrainian defences in several directions in an attempt to fully encircle the small eastern city of Bakhmut, which, of course, we've been watching for months and months, haven't we? How might what is happening on the ground now in the days ahead potentially change?
From a military perspective, as you say, we've been talking about Bakhmut for 7 months. And actually, if you look at this from a purely military perspective, Russia's been pushing, hasn't been making great progress, been suffering huge casualties. And this is all part of a Russian offensive, which, frankly, you should do a little bit of offence, gain some momentum, pause, refresh your soldiers, replenish them, and then go again. They should have stopped some time ago. And what's clearly behind this continuing assault around Bakhmut is political pressure. It's not a military competence thing. It's political pressure. It's trophyism. But Bakhmut isn't a military target. It's become highly symbolic. And unfortunately, it's become a gladiatorial ego war between President Zelensky and President Putin. And President Putin is determined to keep making progress. The amazing tenacity of the Ukrainians to stand firm. You'll have seen that even Lloyd Austin and the American Chief of Staff of the military have been really keen for the Ukrainians to preserve their hardened war fighters.
Got the map here
for the battles ahead. And yet, still now, I mean, to the east of the Bakhmut River, that's Russians. To the west is the Ukrainians. The road you can just see heading out to the bottom is the escape route. The Russians are now making progress across that river. And it's amazingly stoical defence. But literally, Ukraine is the David to the Goliath of Russia. And Russia, if Ukraine is going to mount effective counterattacks, which is what the Western weapons, the tanks, are all there to do, they must preserve some of their hardened war fighters. But of course, at the moment, Russia's paying a high price for this. And I think this announcement, will just harden Putin's resolve that he's going to keep pushing,
The other thing you've been tracking for us over the last few weeks is really the infighting, the tensions between Prigozhin, who's the head of the Wagner mercenary fighters, and also the Russian military. What does this arrest warrant mean for how that dynamic plays out?
Putin probably thought a year ago he was utterly omnipotent. Now that he's got this war underway, there are little cracks starting to appear. He's controlling the information space, But the families back in Russia now are seeing their dead fathers, their sons, their husbands coming back. They're seeing a price for this conflict. Likewise, Prigozhin, who, when the Russian army hasn't performed well on the battlefield, Prigozhin and his convicts have managed to make progress, even though they've suffered horrendous casualties. But Putin probably judged that Russian society would care less about convicts dying than their husbands and their sons back at home. But that led to Prigozhin's influence and power start to rise, and he was becoming very critical and openly so of Putin. That was a threat to Putin, and he's now being put to one side. Prigozhin is no longer allowed access to the prisons to be able to recruit convicts. He's not being given the ammunition he needs, yet he's in one of the fiercest fighting of the war, all of which seems to be undermining. And all of this is Putin now, the cracks are beginning to show around him. Probably not crucial yet, but the cracks are starting to appear.
Interesting. OK, gentlemen, stay with us because we'll be coming back to you shortly. If you are just joining us now on Sky News, it has just gone past 4:30. The news to bring you the breaking news this hour: the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Russia's President Vladimir Putin, accusing him of being responsible for war crimes committed in Ukraine. An arrest warrant has also been issued for Russia's Children's Rights Commissioner for unlawful deportation of Ukrainian children. The ICC released this video statement in the last hour.
The International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, President of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, Commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation. It is forbidden by international law for occupied powers to transfer civilians from the territory they live in to other territories. Children enjoy special protection under the Geneva Convention. The contents of the warrants are secret in order to protect victims. The ICC attaches great importance to the protection of victims, especially children. Nevertheless, the judges of the chamber dealing with this case decided to make the existence of the warrants public in the interest of justice and to prevent the commission of future crimes. This is an important moment in the process of justice before the ICC. The judges have reviewed the information and evidence submitted by the prosecutor and determined that there are credible allegations against these persons for the alleged crimes. The ICC is doing its part of work. As a court of law, the judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
Well, as you might predict, Russia has responded to that warrant for President Putin's arrest. A Russian Foreign Ministry spokesperson, Maria Zakharova, has said the decisions of the International Criminal Court have no meaning for our country, including from a legal point of view. Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and bears no obligations under it. Meanwhile, Ukraine has welcomed the decision, with the chief of the presidential staff saying it's only the beginning. Well, let's bring back in our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, and also retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell with me now. Dominic, for viewers who are just joining us, just summarise for us what exactly the ICC has said, what those charges are and what that means in practice for President Putin. Well,
the Russian leader and his Children's Rights Commissioner are accused of being allegedly responsible for the abduction, deportation of children from Ukraine, about which there has been a lot of concern and controversy throughout this conflict. Thousands of children have been taken from Ukraine and have been transported sometimes through Crimea, occupied Crimea, but then into Russia, often to fates unknown. So there are now arrest warrants out for both of those individuals, and if they were were able to stray, if they were ever to stray into countries who are compliant with the ICC, they would then be liable to arrest. Now, that's unlikely to happen, of course, but it does highlight the plight of these children and the issue of the controversy around their fate. One respected human rights group in America has estimated that 6,000 Ukrainian children have been deported to Russia. The Ukrainians reckon it's more like 16,000. The Russians themselves have said since 2014, 700,000 children have been taken from Ukraine. And I think that kind of gets the heart of this issue. The Russians say they're saving children from war, from the perils of shell fire, but also from a Nazi-controlled country. The Ukrainians say they're just being taken to be adopted by Russians, but the older ones to be put into military camps to then fight in this war, to be trained. Now, there's not enough evidence to bear out exactly what is happening to them, but we can say that a lot of children are going missing. We personally, in December, went to an orphanage in Kherson region where the director told us that 15 children had been taken by the Russians. Soldiers had come in armoured vehicles and taken them to Crimea. They have somehow managed to escape to Georgia, and we went there last week and spoke to them. They've had an extraordinary journey, extraordinary story, which we can tell later. But we're able to get CCTV footage of Russian soldiers going through this orphanage, which should be a place of sanctuary for children, looking for children. Exactly why they're doing that is not clear. Now, the Russians say they're saving them, but I think the suspicion is it's more that partly to help them demographically and to bolster their troop numbers, the older ones, but it's also for propaganda reasons. And we have seen Ukrainian children and orphans being paraded at events like the event in Moscow at the stadium that Putin went to recently. And they're being paraded saying to the Russian population, so for domestic consumption, that we're saving these children. We're doing a good job out there, trying to bolster their claim that they are effectively saving the Ukrainians from themselves.
It is a profoundly troubling aspect of this war, isn't it, what's been happening with the children? But it is a relatively narrow charge relative to what the ICC could have gone for. What's your read on why this particular aspect?
Well, I'm not a legal expert, but I think it is certainly remarkable they have focused on this one narrow. I mean, it's certainly a very high-profile issue and significant and has drawn a lot of attention and controversy and concern. And I think if you're looking at the plight of different Ukrainians, the plight of children is certainly the most emotional and arguably the most important. But I think the suspicion is that the ICC and other bodies are compiling evidence, and therefore they're going to present these arrest warrants, these indictments, these cases against the Russians as they feel they're in a position to do so. And they do appear to be confident they have enough now, at least to issue arrest warrants against Putin and his Children's Rights Commissioner, who I have to stress has welcomed the ICC, saying that she thinks it's great the ICC has appreciated her work to help the children of this country, which I mean, it sounds completely
almost Orwellian, that sort of response.
It sounds back to front. It sounds very strange, but a lot of the way we've seen the Russians and their whole propaganda war has been almost through the looking glass, in a sort of Alice in Wonderland way. What we see as abhorrent, they are presenting as an act of salvation, of helping the children. And certainly that's how she's presented her efforts in Russian state media. And that's how I think they're probably being seen by the majority of Russians.
All right, Dominic, thank you very much indeed. Sean, we'll be coming to you shortly, so don't go anywhere. We're awaiting a response, of course, from Number 10 to these developments from the International Criminal Court. There has been a response from the leader of the opposition, Sir Keir Starmer, who has said, I welcome the International Criminal Court's decision to open war crime cases against Vladimir Putin and other senior Russian figures for their barbaric actions in Ukraine. Today's announcement sends an important message. There will be no hiding place for Putin and his cronies, and the world is determined to make them pay for what they've done. I have seen firsthand the destruction and devastation waged on the brave people of Ukraine. These cases are just the tip of the iceberg. One day, Putin will face justice. Until then, the focus of all who believe in Ukraine's liberty and freedom must continue to be on ensuring her victory. Well, let's bring in our US correspondent, Mark Stone, who joins us now from Washington. Mark, as I understand it, we haven't had an official response yet from the White House, but what is it likely to be?
Nothing official yet from the White House. Incidentally, I've just been speaking to contacts up at the United Nations. They are preparing a statement, I think, as is the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, in London. So I think that hints at the slight surprise with which everyone has been taken with this news. Not to say that there wasn't an expectation that some sort of criminal case against Vladimir Putin would be brought at some stage, but the form it would take and precisely when it would come, that much wasn't entirely clear. The Americans, along with the Europeans and with the British, have for many months been compiling evidence at many levels against Vladimir Putin, but trying to join the dots, to use the phrase of one official I spoke to recently, from crimes that were committed on the ground in Ukraine, Bucha, Irpin. Those are two towns which have become synonymous with such horrendous crimes against humanity, which is incidentally what the Americans believe we are talking about in this case. Nothing official yet, but President Biden does have what's known as an ambassador at large for global criminal justice. Her name is Beth Van Schack, and I spoke to her a few weeks ago. And the first question I put to her was, you know, how likely is it really that we will see Vladimir Putin in the dock, in a courtroom? Is that really likely? And she said that we should never rule it out, that this is all about a long game. She pointed out that Augusto Pinochet, Slobodan Milosevic, these were men who never thought that they would see a courtroom, and yet in time, and it took a long time, they did. She talked about how this is about deterrence apart from anything else. If you can be seen to pursue one person and people through his or her chain of command and have successes, either at lower levels or indeed at the leader themselves, as they did with Milosevic and Pinochet, then it deters, so they hope, others from perhaps acting in the same way. She talked too about the different avenues, and clearly the avenue that they have that is gaining some ground is the International Criminal Court, but the domestic criminal justice system in Ukraine is also pursuing cases as well. The Ukrainian leader would like to pursue the crime of aggression. There are complications with that. The United States is not wholly on board with that particular avenue, not least because they faced accusations of that 20 years ago exactly with the invasion of Iraq, a false equivalence, so say the Americans. Nevertheless, the Americans are not actually a signatory of the ICC. They don't believe that is a problem. They support it fully, but they're not a signatory itself. One of the other things that really struck me, and we've discussed this briefly already, is the wealth of evidence. More than any other war in history, there is so much evidence that is being collated at many different levels, and they are using that, whether it be CCTV, photographs, images from the news media like this, but also in the palms of everyone's hands. Every Ukrainian has a mobile phone, and they have documented crimes which have been collated and are being put together to form this case against Vladimir Putin and everyone in the chain of command. People will slip up, Ambassador Van Schack said to me, and when they do slip up, when they cross borders, when they use aliases, we will find them. She's just been in Ukraine and was then in The Hague, where the International Criminal Court is based, and so they're working together to try and bring to justice those people responsible. You'll remember back in at the time of Saddam Hussein, the Americans put together a pack of cards of those who they believed were responsible, along with Saddam Hussein, for crimes in that country. I would imagine we will see images over the course of the next few months of individuals within the Russian chain of command who they want to arrest. And at the top of that pack is Vladimir Putin.
Yeah, OK. Mark, thank you very much indeed. We will, of course, bring you any official response from the White House as and when we get it. President Joe Biden is meeting with the Irish Prime Minister Leo Varadkar this afternoon. Let's bring in now Toby Cadman from The Hague. He is an international criminal and humanitarian law specialist. Mr. Cadman, thank you for joining us on Sky News. How significant is this development?
I think it's hugely significant. We've known for some time that Karim Khan, the prosecutor at the International Criminal Court, was investigating the senior leadership, the Russian Federation, and we heard several days ago leaked information that warrants were forthcoming. I think it will come as a surprise to some that he's gone right to the top as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned, and certainly the charges that are being brought on the basis of this arrest warrant are hugely significant. And as we've already heard, the numbers of children who were being abducted and forcibly taken into Russia is obviously makes the case hugely significant, and actually makes it an easier case to prove. It's a fairly discrete charge, and probably one where the evidence leading up to Vladimir Putin is very strong, and there may be strategic reasons for why the prosecutor has chosen this in particular.
Yeah, I was just going to ask your view on that. Is it that it's easier to prove, because this is a somewhat narrower charge than perhaps the ICC might have gone for?
Absolutely, and what I would say is that this is probably just the very tip of the iceberg. This is the start. Of course, what we've seen, that the allegations coming out previously that this is a state policy that goes right to the very top. Vladimir Putin has spoken himself about these matters publicly in the past, and quite often we see children being left out of the international criminal justice process, and I think it is hugely significant to focus on this. Of course, there are just a huge array of crimes that could be charged and will be charged, and as we've already heard from the correspondent in Washington, that we're not looking just at the ICC. There is also domestic prosecutions, and there is also the possibility for the crime of aggression to be prosecuted in a special tribunal. So I think this is very much the start, and it is a hugely significant step.
Some reluctance, though, notably from the United States, as we were hearing there from Mark Stone, for going after the war crime of aggression. Might this change things?
Well, I think it probably will change things. Of course, there has been a certain level of discord between the International Criminal Court and those pushing for a special Nuremberg-style tribunal, and maybe this is a way to prevent that being taken away from the ICC. I think there is some concern that setting up a special tribunal would really sort of divert the very necessary funding that goes to the ICC and the very important work that it's doing. So it may well be that this is also a strategic decision taken by the prosecutor of the ICC. But of course, there are real complications with having a special tribunal for the crime of aggression.
What are the chances, do you think, of President Putin ever facing justice in The Hague?
Well, look, I think we have to be very realistic that we're not going to see Putin in The Hague anytime soon. And of course, there'll be a lot of cynicism as to whether we will ever see him there. Of course, we won't be looking at a trial in absentia at the ICC. And of course, there are other state parties in whose territory he may enter have a responsibility to hand him over to the ICC. But as we've seen with the al-Bashir case in Sudan, who was indicted for genocide and still has not been handed over, there are very real problems with that. And of course, an individual, a political figure like Vladimir Putin is going to be so much more problematic than al-Bashir in Sudan. And so I think that there is going to be a great deal of fear and reluctance if he is to enter. But it may well be that it prevents him from actually leaving Russia. And that in itself should not be insignificant. It has a huge impact. And of course, justice is measured in many, many different ways. And the fact that they have issued the arrest warrant and are proceeding to charge him is significant enough in itself.
Do you think that internally, very difficult, as you're saying there, for him to leave Russia, internally, it weakens his grip on power?
Absolutely. And I think that this is sort of a further chink in the armor of what we have been seeing increasingly over the last few weeks, both internally and externally. Of course, the position that they're taking now is a position of strength. They're saying that they don't recognise the ICC, and of course, his minister, who's also subject to the arrest warrant as well, is welcoming it. I'm sure they do not welcome it. This is not what they wanted. They repeatedly say the ICC has no jurisdiction over Russian citizens. It does because of the situation in Ukraine. And it may well be, just going back to the charges, that Karim Khan has chosen these charges in particular because it's a crime that occurs on two states, Ukraine and Russia. And as the ICC has ruled in previous cases, it has the jurisdiction for those crimes of forced deportation. So it's an easier one jurisdictionally as well as evidentially to bring.
Toby Cadman, really good of you to give us your analysis on Sky News. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Well, let's bring you this now from the United Nations in New York, where in the last few minutes, the Secretary-General's spokesperson has been asked about this news that the ICC has issued an arrest warrant for President Vladimir Putin.
As we've said many times before here, the International Criminal Court is independent of the Secretariat. We do not comment on their actions.
But does it have any impact in the way the UN operates with regard to the president of Russia? For example, if President Putin wanted to visit any UN headquarters, whether it was in Geneva, Vienna, New York, would he be permitted to enter? Will the Secretary-General still talk or meet with President Putin?
I don't want to answer hypothetical questions because, as you know, issues of travel involve others. We will continue, as a general rule, the Secretary-General will speak to whomever he needs to speak in order to deal with the issues in front of him.
Does he, though, fear that this is a threat to diplomacy? Because President Putin is clearly the person who started the war in Ukraine. One might assume that you need President Putin to bring the war to an end. One can't see, or I can't see, President Putin being allowed to come by the host country, the US, to the UN General Assembly High-Level Week. I can't see how you could foresee another summit between President Biden and President Putin, as we saw in Geneva. Is this a threat, this arrest warrant, to the diplomacy that you're working so hard for?
As I said, and this applies across the board, the Secretary-General will always speak to whomever he needs to speak to in order to advance our work.
But lots of other people won't be able to speak to President Putin.
I can only speak for him. Deji, and then Joe.
Let's just speak for. You can just speak for Secretary General on this. Since the ICC has issued the warrants for President Putin, will this affect the Secretary General's decision to meet or to talk with Mr. Putin?
As I said to James, as a rule of thumb across the board, Secretaries General will speak to whomever they need to speak to advance the issues that are on their desks.
Regardless, there's the warrant or not.
Joe and then Pam.
There's been a response from the Foreign Secretary. James Cleverly has tweeted, those responsible for horrific war crimes in Ukraine must be brought to justice. We welcome the step taken by the independent ICC to hold those at the top of the Russian regime, including Vladimir Putin, to account. Work must continue to investigate the atrocities committed. Let's bring in our international affairs editor, Dominic Waghorn, also retired Air Vice Marshal Sean Bell. Dominic, to you first of all, hearing that question there in the UN, it's finely balanced, isn't there? And many people saying that Russia should be kicked out. They shouldn't have a seat on the Security Council, but it is an arena of diplomacy.
Yeah, and I think, we're seeing the spokesperson there slightly caught on the hop, sounding rather surprised, choosing his words carefully, but being asked about what I think the question that a lot of us are asking already. What does this mean for the peace process, if there is one, the hope for a negotiated end to this war? Because if he is an indicted war criminal, how can Vladimir Putin fly somewhere to discuss and negotiate the end of the conflict? It does make it more complicated. It makes it more complicated also for countries like Kazakhstan, where James Cleverly has just landed, where he has tweeted from a country that has abstained in votes on this issue, this war, twice now, because it's close to Russia. Now, I think under pressure, countries like Kazakhstan to work out on whose side they really are. Can they continue hedging their bets when the leader of Russia is what could be an indicted war criminal? So it makes it more complicated for them, and I think it certainly makes it more complicated for the UN, but also for any diplomat who's hoping to give Vladimir Putin an off-ramp, as it's called, out of this conflict.
I was just going to bring in Sean there, and it complicates matters for bringing an end to the war.
It does massively. Whilst this is a significant development from a West perspective, I do wonder from Putin's perspective whether there's anything more than a minor speed bump. He's got a decision to make. His invasion has not gone well. He's stalled. He's getting his nation on a war footing, his industry on a war footing, his people, but he probably was facing an imminent decision about whether you negotiate to at least pause the war. It's very hard to see that this decision will help that happen. And Putin almost certainly has a date with destiny. He walks in the shadows of the Peter the Great, and it's very difficult to see how this is going to stop him.
OK, gentlemen, thank you very much for your analysis. You're watching Sky News. Stay with us. Coming up in the next hour, more on the breaking news that the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin.
It's 5 o'clock. You're watching the News Hour. I'm Simon Mawson. Coming up in the next 60 minutes, the International Criminal Court issues an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin, accusing the Russian president of committing war crimes in Ukraine.
The International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, president of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova.
The Kremlin insists that the decision is null and void as Ukrainian authorities hail it as an historic step on a long road to justice. Also ahead, summer holidays under threat as unions warn of significant delays to renewals as passport staff announce 5 weeks of strikes. Hundreds of people are arrested in France during protests against plans to raise the retirement age there. And Paris Hilton tells Sky News of her experiences in America's controversial camps for troubled teens.
It was almost like they enjoyed abusing children. And just every day I was just praying that I would wake up from this nightmare.
Good evening. We begin with breaking news, and the International Criminal Court has issued an arrest warrant for the Russian President Vladimir Putin. The court has accused Mr. Putin of war crimes, including the unlawful deportation of children from Ukraine to Russia. Well, Moscow says the decision has no significance whatsoever, with Ukrainian authorities calling it just the beginning. Well, here's what the head of the International Criminal Court had to say.
The International Criminal Court has issued 2 warrants of arrest in the Ukraine situation. For Vladimir Putin, president of the Russian Federation, and for Maria Lvova-Belova, commissioner of the Russian President for Children's Rights, for the alleged war crimes of deportation of children from Ukrainian occupied territories into the Russian Federation. It is forbidden by international law for occupying powers to transfer civilians from the territory they live in to other territories. Children enjoy special protection under the Geneva Convention. The contents of the warrants are secret in order to protect victims. The ICC attaches great importance to the protection of victims, especially children. Nevertheless, the judges of the chamber dealing with this case decided to make the existence of the warrants public in the interest of justice and to prevent the commission of future crimes. This is an important moment in the process of justice before the ICC. The judges have reviewed the information and evidence submitted by the prosecutor and determined that there are credible allegations against these persons for the alleged crimes. The ICC is doing its part of work. As a court of law, the judges issued arrest warrants. Their execution depends on international cooperation.
Well, the Kremlin has responded to the ICC decision, calling it null and void. And in a statement, the Russian Foreign Ministry spokesman, Maria Zakharova, said the decisions of the International Criminal Court have no meaning for our country, including from a legal point of view. Russia is not a party to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court and bears no obligations under it. Well, meanwhile, Ukraine has welcomed the decision, with the chief of the presidential staff saying it's only the beginning. Ukraine's Prosecutor General Andriy Kostin said, "This is a historic decision for Ukraine and the entire international law system. Today's decision is a historic step, but it is only the beginning of the long road to restore justice." Well, in the last few minutes, the Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, has tweeted his response. Those responsible for horrific war crimes in Ukraine must be brought to justice. We welcome the step taken by the independent ICC to hold those at the top of the Russian regime, including Vladimir Putin, to account. Work must continue to investigate the atrocities committed. Well, our international affairs editor Dominic Waghorn is in the studio with me now. So, of course, welcomed by Ukraine, which has also been conducting their own independent investigation, Dominic. But interesting responses from the Kremlin, not just from the Foreign Ministry, which we spoke of there, but the Children's Commissioner, very much a response that fits Russia's narrative.
Yes, so the ICC has issued arrest warrants for two people, Vladimir Putin, but also his Children's Rights Commissioner, Maria Lvova-Belova, who is a controversial figure. She claims to have adopted and saved, in her words, 22 Ukrainian orphans, including a 15-year-old boy who Russian state TV aired an interview with, and in a piece where Maria Lvova-Belova was seen to be weeping with joy, as she put it, at the opportunity she'd been given to save these children. So she is seen by people outside Russia, and particularly by Ukrainians, as responsible for this systematic efforts to abduct and deport Ukrainian children. She's presenting it as an effort to save them. And this is her response to what's happened to her. She says, in response to the ICC arrest warrant, "It is great that the international community has appreciated this work to help the children of our country, that we don't leave them in war zones, that we take them out, that we create good conditions for them, that we surround them with loving, caring people." So she is seeing this as a badge of honour, the fact that she has now been named in this arrest warrant and that the ICC wants to put her on trial for alleged crimes, war crimes, to do with the abduction of children. It just shows you the kind of through-the-looking-glass, topsy-turvy way that the Russians have portrayed this war throughout on any number of issues. They have sent soldiers into orphanages that we've been to in Ukraine, that we have CCTV footage of, looking for children, to take them and abduct them. We interviewed some children last week in Georgia who told us that they refused to go, and when they refused to go, the Russians fired guns into the air. So they were forcibly put on transports into Crimea and sent into Russia. And so we have testimony, and the ICC clearly has a lot more of it, that shows that this has been a systematic forcible attempt to remove children against their own will, whereas the Russians are presenting it as an effort to save these children
and connecting it directly to Vladimir Putin as well, Dr.
Yes, and that's what's remarkable about this, I think, and it makes it all the more surprising. I think the time is interesting as well, and I don't think the timing's related to this, but obviously next week Xi Jinping, China's president, is going to Moscow to meet with Vladimir Putin. It makes it more difficult for him. I think it's more awkward for him now that he's going to be sitting down with a man who has an international war crimes arrest warrant out for him. The Chinese are not part of the ICC. They haven't subscribed to the treaty for various reasons. They object to the concept of extraterritorial jurisprudence, but they have cooperated with the ICC and they certainly have been in touch with its authorities. So it'll be very interesting to see how they react to this extraordinary development in this war.
Yeah, and the UK, of course, just calling on China to try and negotiate a peace deal. Dominic, thanks very much indeed for now. Well, let's bring in our chief correspondent, Stuart Ramsey. He's in Dnipro in Ukraine for us, and our US correspondent, Mark Stone, in Washington, DC. Stuart, let's come to you first. How are people in Ukraine reacting to this? You have covered this war since the beginning and, of course, witnessed some of those war crimes that people speak of.
Yeah, I mean, President Zelensky has been going to the ICC since the beginning of the year, saying there are lots of war crimes that need to be investigated here, and are, in fact, being investigated here, including the abduction of children. People here will obviously be very pleased that the ICC has made this decision, though I think they're probably all pretty realistic that it's not going to change very much in the short term. But the ICC has shown in the past it is prepared to take its time, and as long as it takes, to bring people to trial. But it is a big story here, and it is a very big issue. I was talking to an NGO who's telling me that in the last year or so, they estimate that 16,000 children were taken from here to Russian territory. But the figure is incredible. When you go back to 2014, if you take all the years since this Russian effectual invasion began, they say as many as 700,000 children have actually been taken away to Russian territory, and many of them have not come back. Now, I was interviewing a 15-year-old girl the other day who went to a summer camp, and that's how it was sold to her and her family. She says when she got there, it was clear that wasn't the case. They had to sing the Russian national anthem. They weren't allowed to have the yellow and blue colours of Ukraine in their bedrooms, and they were told they weren't going home. Now, her mum travelled about 8,000 kilometres to come and get her, and she did go to Crimea and got her out. What was interesting, well, many interesting points in our interview, but what was interesting, she said when they were left, she joined over 100 buses with 30 to 40 children on each, just on her trip that headed to Russian territory. So it sort of shows the scale of the movement of children, and that's why President Putin and others, that's what they're being accused of. It is, as I say, an extremely big issue. People are very upset about it here, but I think they will be pleased that at least these sort of steps have taken place today, specifically with those children. But, as I say, there's an awful lot more allegations of war crimes here than just that.
Exactly. Stuart Ramsey for now. Thanks very much indeed. Let's take you straight over to the United States and our correspondent Mark Stone, who is there now. Mark, no official word yet from Washington and President Biden, but the US does have an ambassador at large for global criminal justice, and Ambassador Beth Van Schaak is the sixth one. She came into her position just after this war begun, and you've been speaking to her recently.
Yes, I spoke to her a few weeks ago around the time of the anniversary of the invasion, and since we spoke, she has been to Ukraine itself. She spent a few days there seeing firsthand the evidence that is being collected on the ground in towns like Bucha and Irpin, where so many war crimes, as the Americans now categorise them, have been committed. She's also been to The Hague as well, where she would have met officials from the ICC. Her office have told me in the last few minutes that they're preparing a statement, but they're clearly pleased with this. This was always one of several avenues that the State Department's Global Criminal Justice Department has been pursuing. The ICC being, as I say, one of several avenues The domestic judicial process in Ukraine is another avenue. President Zelensky has also, as we've been discussing, been trying to pursue a case against the crime of aggression. The act of the invasion itself is a crime, and from that, the other war crimes have been committed. So argues President Zelensky. That is another avenue. It's slightly more complicated, certainly from an American perspective, but it's something that they do broadly support as well. There has been a statement, the only one so far, from Lindsey Graham, a very senior senator on Capitol Hill, one-time chair of the Justice Committee on Capitol Hill as well. I'll read a bit of it to you. It says, the decision by the ICC to issue an arrest warrant for Vladimir Putin is a giant step in the right direction for the international community. It is more than justified by the evidence. To forgive and forget Putin's war crimes that are occurring on an industrial scale would damage the rule of law-based world order established at the end of World War II. So that's the words there of Senator Lindsey Graham, and I imagine that will be mirrored on both sides of the aisle here on Capitol Hill. President Biden, who's meeting the Taoiseach today, is I would expect will make some sort of statement at some point. The key question that I put to Ambassador Van Schaak when we spoke a few weeks ago, I said that many will see it as inconceivable that Vladimir Putin could literally be in the dock, could have his day in court. And I said, how important is it to pursue justice, however unlikely it would be? She disagreed with the premise of my question. She doesn't think it is inconceivable that this man could appear in a courtroom. She pointed to history, Slobodan Milosevic, Augusto Pinochet, Hissan Habre of Chad. These are all men who thought that they had escaped justice, but they faced justice. Yet, against that, others did not. President Assad of Syria is still in power in Syria, despite the war crimes that he has committed. So there are huge, huge challenges, and they're then under no illusions that it will be easy. But they do believe that it's a long game. It's a game of deterrence as well. To pursue one person deters others, either in another country or down the chain of command within Putin's regime. It deters them from war crimes too. So it's a long game. It's about joining the dots. And eventually, I imagine this is the beginning. There will not just be this charge related to children, very emotive, against Putin, but many other charges. And it will not just be Putin, but a chain of people right the way down to soldiers on the ground in Ukraine, Russian soldiers on the ground in Ukraine. They will slip up, Ambassador Van Schaak said to me. They will cross borders. They will use aliases. If we know what they look like, we will get them eventually.
Mark Stone in Washington, D.C. Thank you.